Abolish Time, Zine Issue Number 1 by Estelle Ellison. Chapter 1: Why Men Must Perform Care Work. Men must participate in care work and reproductive labor. Women and queer folk have, historically and presently, been saddled with this integral part of a healthy community, while patriarchy thrives off of this status quo. Despite the fact that life simply cannot exist without these skill sets, it is a fundamental function of patriarchy that everyone, other than cis heteronormative men, is expected to perform reproductive labor. Reproductive labor includes, but is not limited to, emotional labor, housework, cooking, healthy communication skills, tending to access needs, providing transportation when possible, active listening, childcare, and expressions of empathy. Patriarchal power, then, is based on an exemption from the very work that makes humanity possible. Patriarchy is pride in unsatisfactory emotional skills. In many leftist spaces, men pay lip service to ending patriarchy and its exploitation of women, but very rarely set themselves to the task of becoming healers, doing deep relational work, or subverting the dominant gendered division of labor. Given these circumstances, it is no surprise that radical queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and women of color inclusive intersectional feminism has grown in strength within spaces that have largely excluded men. The less skilled men are in care work as well as emotional and reproductive labor, the more insulation from men becomes synonymous with survival for everyone else. The circles where self-proclaimed radical men declare their willingness to learn, it is oftentimes only if those around them who already possess these skills are willing to teach men. This may seem harmless to some, however, this only normalizes a status quo where it is okay for men to not be experts in these skills or fail to build them of their own volition. We see this line of thinking emerge where men share their emotional selves whenever they are alone with women or queer friends, but conceal these parts of themselves when in the company of other men. Likewise, believing this status quo sets the stage for homophobic, transphobic, and misogynist put-downs between men, further reinforcing patriarchal power dynamics. If men can accept that it is their own responsibility to train up their capacity for care work and reproductive labor, and not the responsibility of everyone else on the other side of the patriarchal division of labor, men can deal an enormous blow to patriarchal power and help make it more possible for everyone to have a more livable life. So why is it so rare that we find men supporting and encouraging other men to build up their emotional skills and dismantle their own patriarchal behaviors? The identity of heteronormative men is largely tied up with patriarchal social capital, so the possibility of losing that power frightens most men into inaction and complacency. This remains true even for a good portion of men who may not realize this explicitly. Men instinctively understand the reality of patriarchal violence, and it is this awareness that informs their complacency. We need men who betray their gendered positionality or relationship to others structured by power dynamics inherent to life under patriarchy. We need cis-straight men to challenge patriarchal behavior even if they know it means they may be put down or ostracized by other men. These same men need to practice emotional honesty and help each other learn to hold space. Men cannot leave it to women and queer folks to dispel patriarchal behavior from every man on earth. In organizing spaces, we need men to adopt slower-paced work and exercise patience. Wherever men calmly hold space for others, they help to create even more opportunities to perform care work and practice active listening. The more proactive men become towards reproductive labor, the more space women have to construct holistic, sustainable, and joyful lives. We need men who can embrace and accept criticism instead of participating in tone policing and expressing impatience with differing communication styles. We need men to actively exercise self-awareness and express a willingness to learn from people who are not men. Men must aspire to end patriarchy and accept that this goal cannot be reached without men who are skilled healers, loving care workers, and willing participants in reproductive labor. Men have to dream themselves a livable life separate from toxic masculinity if they wish to detach their legacies from a long and traumatic past. Men must make a choice between violence and care. Chapter 2: Erasing Patriarchy from the Future. So our goal is the end of patriarchy. Our lives have been shaped by patriarchal power dynamics, and our life task is to unlearn the behaviors we've had forced onto us since birth. We must also survive patriarchal violence that seeps into our daily lives and creates obstacles to joy and liberation. We who aren't cis heteronormative men are burdened and overly familiar with this struggle. It is hard to imagine a world without patriarchy, and it is even harder to think about the many ways that may bring us to that future. What follows is a companion piece to Why Men Must Perform Care Work, supplementing it with more nuanced parts of our effort to erase patriarchy from our collective future. Previously, we discussed how women, queer, and trans folks are drawn to each other and create spaces together for safety. We see that we're largely conditioned to anticipate harm from cis hetero men, or, at the very least, we expect to be let down. As cishet, short for cis heteronormative, men come up against the boundaries and safe spaces that women, queer, and trans folks have created out of necessity, they feel entitled to women's time, as well as the time of anyone that cishet men perceive to be aligned with women. The spaces dominated by cishet men are largely unsafe for anyone else, which means cishet men are faced with a double task. They must make these spaces safer for people who are not cishet men and also create networks that build up and encourage care work, emotional labor, and reproductive labor in cishet men. Essentially, cishet men must work to dismantle the very power dynamics that create patriarchal privilege, and these efforts must be in solidarity with intersectional feminist movements. This is feminism that includes women of color, queer, and trans folks, working class folks, and other people who face patriarchal oppression. With that said, we can address the less apparent dynamics that result from what we have. Trans men, particularly trans men who are not often assumed to be cis, do not venture into spaces dominated by men as a matter of safety. Additionally, it is not always safe for queer and trans men to intervene against violence and other harmful behaviors from cishet men. It is wise to hold space for this reality. At the same time, some queer and trans men, particularly trans men who are assumed cis or pass, may participate in patriarchal behaviors that must also be dismantled. Where this is the case, it is important for that learning to be done in a way that does not require the work of people outside of these identity markers. Another crucial dynamic worth discussing is the different ways transphobia makes its way into people's discussions about care work, emotional labor, and reproductive labor. Non-binary people, also known as NBs, and trans women, particularly those who are not assumed to be cis or do not pass, are not always welcome in feminist spaces. This dynamic is a misguided byproduct of the reality of patriarchal violence, and it puts NBs and trans women in a vulnerable position as a result of this transphobia. AMAB, assigned male at birth NBs, and trans women are sometimes referred to as socialized men, which dismisses lifetimes of misgendering and being ostracized, ridiculed, teased, excluded, and harassed. We must move away from biological reductionism, or assuming that our identities are directly tied to our assigned sex at birth. Put simply, it is harmful to automatically assume the behaviors of trans women and NB are a result of their assigned sex at birth. To close, here are some suggested starting points for people. Men forming groups to unlearn their patriarchal behaviors and practice care. Men's groups that go out to observe public areas where street harassment may occur and intervene where it is safe to. Men offering security support for gatherings organized by women and queer folks. Making community agreements that include trans people and NBs. Groups making space for men to report back on their self-work and interventions against patriarchy. Chapter 3: Ending Burnout Culture. My good friend and comrade asked some good questions that lead me to write this follow-up piece, going into a little more depth about leadership, burnout culture, and mutual aid. During our conversation, they offered that survival work is the work when it is mutualistic. I hope this reading helps people think through our abolitionist goals and the different ways we can build a more livable future. Leadership is a power dynamic. It is an agreement to defer our collective agency to an individual or body of individuals based on the belief that we lack what they have. We follow leaders when we show up for the work that they lead. But what allowed us to show up in the first place? Both bosses and leaders support breaks and time away from the work, as long as it enables you to come back. The boss is unconcerned with how low wages, demanding hours, and expensive healthcare all affect your well-being. The leftist leader acknowledges those hardships, but asks for your self-sacrifice on behalf of those who are less fortunate. Both fail to see how the work itself is what burns people out. How can we build our collective capacity to survive? This question is born out of burnout culture. Whenever the work drains the capacity of its organizers, we are left to seek out our own care outside of the organizations we help to create and sustain. Despite the fact that left organizations are where many anti-capitalists find some sense of community, we struggle to name what community care and mutual aid actually look like in practice. But what about our lives when we are not at meetings and workshops? What do we do with our lives when we clock out? What leader is there who is actually cultivating our collective survival? Who is building relationships and connections that build people's capacity to thrive? Do the groups we give our time to truly have the capacity to move every community beyond capitalism? Survival work is the work when it is mutualistic. Mutual aid creates opportunities for us to collectively figure out where all the roadblocks are to our liberation. When we are acting from a place of love, building community, and becoming intertwined in each other's lives, we are building a collective capacity to thrive in a life that feels livable. Mutual aid moves away from the power dynamics inherent to leadership and hierarchy, and instead presents a way of relating to each other that focuses on our well-being. Mutual aid is a horizontal praxis that teaches us how we can best support the people we already have in our lives. By building collective care and discovering the myriad ways we can make imperialist, white, supremacist, capitalist patriarchy obsolete, we bring our communities into the future.